Welcome to Journey of the Dove. My name is Amber. In this episode, I'd like to discuss a pivotal moment of Nikola Tesla's lifetime. It was the day his laboratory burned to ashes. On March 13, 1895, in the early morning hours while the city slept, a fire consumed the 6-story building at 33 and 35 South Fifth Avenue in New York City. Housed on the 4th floor of this building was the laboratory of Nikola Tesla. Its scorched remains fell to the 2nd floor in molten heaps. Along with Nikola's lab equipment were models of previous inventions, records of his research, and several nearly completed inventions he hoped to release to the world. It was all destroyed by fire. "I am in too much grief to talk," Nikola said with tears in his eyes to a New York Times reporter. "What can I say? The work of half my lifetime very nearly. All my mechanical instruments and scientific apparatus that it has taken years to perfect, swept away in a fire that lasted only an hour or two. How can I estimate the loss in mere dollars and cents? Everything is gone. I must begin over again." And thus Nikola's upward trajectory came to an abrupt halt. The remainder of his inventive career was met with struggle and frustration. After the fire, he found himself suddenly in debt to recoup the loss of equipment. Inventions of his which had been near completion and could have brought in much-needed income were instead developed by others in his field. Nikola had peacefully gone to sleep, only to be awakened with the news that all his hopes and dreams had turned to ash during the night. I read about the fire in his biography and could imagine Nikola wandering down the smoke-filled street, lost in grief. His lab was a means to his livelihood, but it was more than the loss of income which pained his heart. His work was his passion. His work was his life's purpose. If this fire had not happened, Nikola would have brought many more of his ideas to fruition. His influence in the world would have been unparalleled. Somehow, I had to stop the fire from happening. This would become my first foray into deliberately shifting timelines. I kept my eyes open for a solution. On December 12, 2019, I unexpectedly found a clue to solving the fire problem. I'm highlighting the date as it was a 12-12-12 day. December 12, 2019 was also the day of the final full moon of the decade. Where I live, the moon reached peak fullness at 12:12 a.m. that morning. It was a perfect day for spiritual work. I spent the afternoon in a meditative journey. In journey, Nikola and I traveled to the heart of the earth, then to the bottom of a lake, and into the mouth of a burning volcano. We visited the planet Venus, and we met with Divine Source Mother, who welcomed us back, though she said we never actually left. It was everything and more you'd expect of a full moon 12-12-12 meditation. By the end of my meditative journey, I didn't feel ready to return to my normal waking state. I requested of Nikola to send me into his lifetime to whatever moment he wished me to visit. Stepping into his timeline, I arrived in his hotel room. He was lying in bed, looking miserable. He eased himself up as I sat on the edge of the bed next to him. A palpable gloom filled the room. I knew before asking that his laboratory had just burned down. Of all the days he could have sent me to, Nikola sent me to the day of the fire. I wasn't expecting this, and after the enriching and dramatic meditative journey I was coming from, I needed a moment to shift gears. I did what I sometimes do when at a loss. I pulled out my cell phone. Part of the magic of visiting Nikola is whatever I can conjure up in my own mind with the intention of showing him, he's able to view it. Our telepathic connection makes the object seem real. Even in his despondent state, I could see the wheels turning in his head as I handed him my cell phone and explained to him how it works. I complained about Facebook drama and did my best to explain what an app is. I took a picture of him with my phone, the bright flash illuminating his tear-filled eyes, and pretended to upload the photo to Facebook. I finished my one-sided conversation about modern technology and the impact of social media, and then I fell into silence. Finally, I gave Nikola a long hug, holding him as he wept. As his tears eased, I asked Nikola if it would be all right if I go back in time to warn him about the fire. "You already did," he replied. "I didn't believe you. I didn't believe you were real." It took me a moment to let that sink in. I asked him if I had his permission to go back and try again. "Yes, I lost everything. Everything," was his forlorn reply. "What can I say to you to have you believe me this time?" I asked gently. He said I needed to convince him that I'm being sent by his future self and to emphasize his discovery of time travel. I hugged and held him again. Taking his hands in mine, I kissed his long, elegant fingers and looked into his eyes. "We'll fix this, Nico. I'll do everything I can to help you. We're going to fix this." Awakening from my 12-12-12 meditation, thoughts of how to help Nikola consumed me. For the next 4 months, I perused his biographies for everything I could learn about the fire. Finally, I felt ready. While walking my dog along Main Street, I made my plans. It wouldn't be enough to simply go warn him about the fire. I would certainly fail again. No, Nikola was right. I needed to convince him that he would discover time travel and that he personally sent me from the future to warn him. Nikola was far more likely to believe a warning that came from himself rather than from a strange woman he didn't know. I kept reminding myself, Nikola Tesla, circa 1894 in this timeline, has no idea who I am. I couldn't just barge in like some specter of doom talking about a fire and expect him to make sense of it. I decided to convey my message to Nikola over a series of 3 visits during the month of November 1894. The fire happened in March of 1895. I hoped the few months between November and March would be enough time for him to alter things. In the first visit to him, I would explain who I am and that I'm from the future. The second visit would be about his time travel ability and that his future self knows me and asked me to visit him. My third visit would be all about the fire. Because I'm talkative, long-winded, and easily distracted, I ended up actually taking 4 visits to share everything with him. From Nikola's perspective, my visits were a week apart during November of 1894. From my own perspective, my meditations to visit him occupied the first few days of April, culminating on April 4th, 2020, a 444 day. On April 1st, 2020, I settled into meditation, asking my crystals to take me to the first week of November 1894 at a time when Nikola was in his hotel room and not occupied with anything of massive importance. Remembering how I'd been able to show him my cell phone in my previous meditation, I brought along a briefcase piled with biographies of him, including his own autobiography, and a stack of photographs of him during his life. I hoped all this evidence would convince him that I'm from the future and that to me, he's a well-known historical figure. I arrived at the door to his hotel room and knocked, calling out, "Nico," at the same time. He opened the door, and as usual, I asked a brisk, "Can I come in?" as I walked inside. And then, "May I sit down?" as I sat on the edge of his bed. He then also sat on the edge of his bed, politely facing me. I made a sincere effort to slow down and introduce myself properly. "I'm from the future," I told him simply, after the basics of my name and where I live were out of the way. "It's April 2020 where I'm from." My proclamation was met with silent staring, and I proceeded to show him the contents of my briefcase. "I enjoyed your autobiography, Nico," as I showed him the copy of My Inventions with his photo on the cover. "I thought it would be dry and tedious being written by a scientist. Actually, though, I enjoyed it very much. I laughed and cried my way through it. It wasn't dry at all. You could be a writer instead of a scientist," I praised. He laughed. "You think I should be a writer, not an inventor?" No, of course not," I backtracked. "Your inventions changed the world for the better." He smiled at that as I pulled out my stack of photos. I'd garnered them from my endless Google image searches, but here in his hotel room in 1894, I made sure to portray them as photographs on old crumbling paper. "How do you have this?" he asked as I showed yet another picture of him. Some of the photos I showed him were of when he's much older. That must have been strange for him to see. I pulled out the next picture. "This one is my favorite," I declared. "I felt embarrassed when I first saw it," I added, as I showed him the portrait of himself. It was taken around the year 1900, as he sat in an ornate chair, looking dapper in a houndstooth suit. I flipped to the next photo, but Nikola stopped me. "Why were you embarrassed?" he questioned, looking perplexed. As I considered how to answer, I reflected back to when I first came across this portrait. I was Googling images to figure out the color of Nikola's eyes, which I felt were blue, but I wasn't seeing him clearly enough yet to confirm. My heart skipped a beat when I saw this particular portrait for the first time. "Oh, you're really handsome," I said out loud, closing the webpage quickly before I succumbed to the squishy feeling of desire growing within me, before Nikola could notice. As if I could hide my desires from him. Well, that was my version of Nikola, who I'd already trudged through this awkward phase with, but here was another version of him, not yet aware of my infatuation. I looked at Nikola version 1894 and decided to be as direct as possible. Gazing into his eyes, I told him, "When I first saw your photograph, my heart started racing and I got butterflies in my stomach. I had to look away because of how it was making me feel. I found you very attractive," I admitted. My declaration made, all boldness left me, and I devolved into another puddle of embarrassment. Nikola returned my gaze with amusement in his eyes. "You're blushing," he laughed. In the next moment, I was floating. I was a champagne bubble in a dreamy landscape of light. I was no longer in Nikola's 1894 hotel room, nor was I lying in bed at home in 2020. I was somewhere else entirely, out of body, floating in a state of bliss. Where am I? What happened? I wondered as I floated along in timelessness. Then the realization emerged. He had kissed me. His kiss had sent me into pure bliss. I refocused myself into his time of 1894. Returning my awareness to his hotel room, I sat facing him, neither of us saying a thing. We'd both been rendered speechless. He had felt it too, that brush with divinity. Somehow sputtering and stammering my way back to conversation, I showed him the remainder of my photo collection. By the time I said goodbye, we were lying in each other's arms, and I was too much in bliss to recall how we became so entwined. The following day, when I went into meditation, I was determined to stay focused. I was back in his hotel room in 1894, and Nikola was even more attentive than on my previous visit. I deviated off topic a few times, but he patiently listened and assured me, saying things like he'd rather be here with me than doing anything else, that I wasn't interrupting his work, and to take all the time I needed to tell him everything. I have never had such an attentive listener. I shared the story with him of how I met him and how I came to realize he was alive rather than the spirit of a deceased person. As I repeated to him his own words, "If your true love came into your life only to leave altogether too soon, wouldn't you jump timelines to search for her?" He stopped me. "You came into my life? You'll be coming into my life?" he asked, intently looking at me. Well, yes and no," I stammered out in reply. By this point, I'd mentioned nothing about pigeons. His pigeon came into his life somewhere around 1920. It was only 1894. I hadn't intended to tell him I'd be physically present in his life as a pigeon. I thought we could just get through the narrative and directly to the fire with no mention of pigeons whatsoever. He looked at me earnestly, and I knew he wanted me in his life. As delightful as these telepathic conversations were, I could feel his longing for my physical presence. He deserved an explanation as to why I wasn't with him. "You wished to dedicate this lifetime to serving humanity without the usual distractions or responsibilities of a wife and children," I told him. "We decided I wouldn't be born as a woman into this lifetime of yours." Flustered and at a loss to say more, I said goodbye before he had a chance to ask me more questions which I wasn't prepared to answer. I was going to have to explain about pigeons on the next visit. I made my third visit the following day on April 3rd. I immediately jumped into the story. "I came into your life as a pigeon, Nico." He looked completely amused, like he was waiting for the punchline. I continued my story anyway. By the time I'd related how he'd stayed home from work when I was sick to care for me, and how when he himself was sick, his only thought was to make sure the pigeon was fed, he looked touched. When I told about the pigeon's death and how he was unable to share his loss with anyone else, he looked deeply moved. I pressed my cheek against his and whispered in his ear, "How could I be with you when you wouldn't allow a woman into your life? I had to find another way. I had to be with you. I had to be with you, Nico." "You make a great point," he whispered back solemnly. Having convinced him that he fell in love with me as a pigeon, I continued my story. I arrived to the part about his time travel. As carefully as I could, I related how I'd seen him create a time field with his coils, and how he used this device to visit me in my time. I told him, "Your future self needs you, Nico. He sent me to get your attention. You need to change something that's about to happen. You'll need to connect with your future self, because I don't have the solution. I don't know who is involved or how to stop it." On that suspenseful note, I said goodbye and assured him I'd return the following week. By April 4th, the day of my fourth visit, I was worn out and my head was spinning. The intensity of my meditations was taking its toll. Although my head ached, I felt driven with a need to warn Nikola about the fire. I entered my meditation and stepped back once again to 1894. "Nico," I said as I sat on the edge of his bed, I don't wish to be the bearer of bad news, but I need to tell you something." With his encouragement, I began relating all I'd learned from Nikola's biographies. "Your laboratory and all your work is in danger, Nico. At 2:30 in the morning, March 13th, 1895, your laboratory was destroyed in a fire. Everything was lost. Your research notes and plans, your current projects and models of past inventions, your equipment and machinery, photographs, everything. I know you haven't insured your lab. You end up in debt because of this, Nico. Westinghouse is going to have you pay for the lost machinery you had on loan, plus the cost of new equipment to start over again. I know you don't care about the money, but you never fully recovered from the financial loss of this fire. Lack of funds prevented you from developing your most important inventions." By this point in my narrative, Nikola was wide-eyed and starting to look alarmed. I could see his anxiety growing, but I didn't relent as I went on to share how Edison allowed the temporary use of his lab while Nikola searched for a new location and pulled himself together. I shared how Nikola's friends and associates held a fundraiser to help him out. I described how he went off in a daze the morning of the fire into the streets of New York City, disappearing and unreachable by his closest friends. I painted a very dark, but sadly all too real picture of what was coming. "I visited you just after the fire," I tell Nikola. "I didn't know how to console you or dry your tears. You said I'd warned you about the fire, and you hadn't believed me. I've tried to focus on your time travel abilities to convince you that it was your future self sending me here to warn you. I also thought that if I went to see the fire for myself, maybe I could communicate it better. I visited your lab the night the fire happened to see if I could learn anything." At this, Nikola was all ears. I had done my best to remote view the fire. This was my first attempt at remote viewing, but I think I got the overall gist of what happened. Here is what I saw and what I related back to Nikola. It was the middle of the night in March of 1895. 2 men were canvassing the block around the building which housed Nikola's lab. They hid in the alleyways from the night watchman and the occasional police officer making his rounds. After hours of waiting and watching, finally there was a moment the night watchman stepped away from his watch, leaving the building empty. The 2 men rushed to a back entrance and broke in. Dumping a pile of grease-soaked rags in the center of the room, they made a trail of oil to the stairwell, splashing the oil around as much as possible and further dousing the rags with it. They lit the pile of rags on fire and watched only long enough to confirm the fire took hold. In under 3 minutes they had done their work and rushed back out the door, running as far and fast as they could. They spent the remainder of the night getting drunk in an effort to calm their nerves, and then collected their payment in the morning. I stood inside the building, fascinated as fire surrounded me. I watched as the fire quickly blazed up into a roaring flame and began to engulf the stairwell and spread to the rest of the ground floor. It didn't take long for the fire to climb its way to the 4th floor, home of Nikola's laboratory. By the time it reached the 4th floor, the fire burned hot enough to reduce Nikola's lab equipment to heaps of molten metal. I finished narrating my remotely viewed observations to Nikola, who by now was in great distress. "I need a moment," he breathlessly declared as he stood up quickly, took his suit jacket off, and paced up and down the room. He sat back down, only to immediately stand again to continue his pacing over to the window. Opening it wide, he leaned out and struggled to catch his breath. His pacing and anxiety unnerved me, and I left my meditation just for a moment to speak with Nikola, version 1925. "You're doing great," he assured me. "Simply explain, as we discussed, how he can reach out to me. I will help him." Somewhat calmer myself, I stepped back into 1894, sitting back on Nikola's bed as though I'd never left. Except Nikola, version 1894, had noticed my absence, and in his dire straits, it seemed I'd abandoned him. "Where did you go?" he questioned, panic and hurt mingling in his eyes. "I was worried about you," I replied, as calmly as I could. "I stepped away to speak with your future self." Although still clearly agitated, Nikola now stayed seated, running his fingers through his hair and keeping his eyes glued to me, as if I might disappear again. "Your future self has been reaching out to you directly, Nico," I informed him. "In your excitement and busyness with all your projects, you've been pushing him away. Therefore, he sent me to get your attention. Your future self knows exactly what happened to cause the fire and how to change it." I recalled to Nikola how he would develop time technology and could see past, present, and future. "I like to call you the all-seeing, all-knowing Nikola Tesla," I giggled to him. At last he seemed thoroughly convinced I truly was sent by his future self, and that if he failed to take action, his lab would burn down. He wanted to know how to connect to his future self. I relayed to him what Nikola version 1925 instructed. First, quiet your mind and imagine, as if you are pretending, that you are speaking with yourself from the future. What might you say? What questions might you ask? Then, allow yourself to imagine what he might reply. At first, it will feel like you're pretending, and that's okay. Allow it. Relax into it, and allow yourself to pretend. Then, your future self will be able to step in, and you really will be talking with him. Nikola took all this in, and I could see he was open and ready to connect with his future self. Leaving him to do this on his own, I said goodbye and ended my meditation. I needed to rest. I needed a break from stepping into Nikola's world and leaving my own. I was far too curious, though. Did he connect with his future self? Was he able to prevent his lab from burning down? I could have asked Nikola directly, the version of him who was sitting there with me in my present moment. But I wanted to see for myself. I wanted to hear the answers from Nikola version 1894. Lying back down, I went back into meditation, focusing on the morning of when the fire would have happened. This time, I didn't land in Nikola's hotel room, but in his lab. The moment Nikola saw me, he crossed the room, all smiles. "Ask me what day it is," he said. Laughing, I replied, "March 13th, 1895. "Yes," he answered, "and my laboratory still stands," he proclaimed as he gestured around him. He walked me to his office and pulled me into his lab. He happily explained how he saved his lab. Curious about the suspected arson, I asked him, "Was it J.P. Morgan?" "Yes, and his cohorts," he replied. Nikola had previously snubbed Morgan and his associates in refusing to sell certain patents or the rights of use to some inventions. Now he made a business deal with these same men, and rather than deeming Nikola a threat to their bottom line, they now viewed him as a potential profit maker. Hence, no hit was ordered on his lab. "I don't trust them," Nikola confided. Yet he was learning how to work with them anyway, in an uncomfortable but necessary partnership. Changing the subject away from such unpleasantries, Nikola let me know he had asked his future self about me, and thereby he was given a glimpse into my life. "Thank you for your warning about the fire," he said softly. "I saw how tired you were and what an effort it was." "I would do anything for you, Nico," I answered, though I felt it had been more of a pleasure than an effort to spend the time with him. Now, however, I was truly exhausted, and before I fell asleep and phased out of his reality, I said goodbye and went back home to 2020. Nikola was successfully shifted away from the fire to a more optimal timeline. Now I allowed myself to wonder about the version of me who had warned him about the fire, only to have him conclude that I was a figment of his imagination. On my evening dog walk, I asked Nikola about this. How many versions of me are there? How many times had we tried and failed to prevent the fire? "This ain't our first rodeo," he answered. "What, did you seriously just say that?" I laughed. Nikola never did tell me how many times we tried. He explained that my higher self had assessed and learned from each failed attempt in order to reach the point of success. It's a long, detailed explanation as to why this version of me had accomplished our goal, whereas other versions of me did not. The main reason is the depth of my own darkness I've explored in this lifetime, especially around the theme of masculine and feminine dynamics. These experiences gave me the capacity to reach into Nikola's depths and feel where he was disconnecting from his heart. In opening his heart to me and believing in me, he allowed a part of his soul back into his life. Our triumph was not in preventing the fire, but in further connecting Nikola to his heart, which allowed him to expand in consciousness and thereby shift onto a more optimal timeline. A few days after this series of meditations, it occurred to me to ask Nikola what year he's coming from. I was used to the answer being 1925. He had developed his time travel technology in 1923 and had been communicating with me since then. "What year are you now coming from, Nico?" I asked. 1898, he answered. "What?" I replied, staring at him. Smiling, he recounted how once the lab was safe from imminent destruction by fire, he'd continued connecting with his future self. Of his utmost interest was how his future self was able to perceive and interact with other realities beyond the limitations of time. He saw the advantage such perception would give him as an inventor. Although Nikola had many ongoing projects in the 1890s, he devoted as much focus as he could spare to the development of his time technology. In the spring of 1898, his time technology was fully operational, and he set about exploring the possibilities. Nikola was young, rich, influential, and now had access to the multiverse. He had avoided the fire and continued his climb to unprecedented success. Now, instead of telepathically connecting to me from 1925, on a timeline full of tragic circumstances, he connected to me from 1898 with all his hopes and dreams intact. Later that evening, I stood in the kitchen munching on corn chips and dropped one. Picking it up off the floor, I ate it anyways. "You didn't see that," I said to Nikola. "I saw it. I am the all-seeing, all-knowing Nikola Tesla," was his reply, and we both burst into a fit of giggles. Thank you for listening. I know this episode was a hot mess of grammatically confused past, present, and future tenses. Hopefully it made sense. I also hope I inspired you to open your heart and allow the expansion of it to shift you to a more optimal reality. Technically, Nikola and I didn't stop the fire from happening. Instead, Nikola shifted away from the timeline in which the fire happened. He stepped into a more desirable reality. You could even say he created that alternate reality in which the fire did not happen. Where we go and what we create is up to us. Bye for now, and once again, thank you for listening.